Now, some of you have heard the story before. A scientist on Krypton by the name of Jor-El discovers that the planet is doomed and tries to tell ignorant council, but they ignore him. Shocker, I know. Seeing that there is no other option, Jor-El and his wife Lara, the infant son Kal-El, in a device that will transport him across the galaxy and eventually end up on Earth, where he's raised by a kind couple and eventually will become a Superboy, eventually growing up into Superman, essentially becoming the definitive superhero. However, this is not his story. Some people like him and others despise him. It's primetime, baby! Today, I'll be going over and analyzing the history of a character that I've always been quite fascinated by, because like the maker before him, he started out as a young reflection of the main hero, full of hope and wonder, but over time it became a more twisted and villainous character. But unlike Reed, Superboy Prime got a more hopeful ending. Temporarily, but I'll get into that later. But before we talk about the subject of this video, I need to explain why he even exists in the first place. First off, you may be asking, what even is Earth Prime? Well, to put it in this way, Earth Prime is essentially a variant of OW, yes, OW, Earth. As in the real place, there's supposed to be no actual superheroes there, just a world almost identical to ours. In case you're also wondering, the comic books that were released on Earth Prime are essentially subconsciously based on events happening all across the DC multiverse. You may also be wondering, if Earth Prime is supposed to be normal, then why does Krypton exist? The real life answer to that is there was a big event happening at the time, known as Crisis on Infinite Earths. And from what I remember, DC wanted a variant of Superboy to take part in the event. Also speculate they wanted a representative of Earth Prime to take part as well. So writer Elliot S. Magan decided to kill two birds with one stone and essentially introduce the Superboy of Earth Prime for the first time in DC Comics Presents issue 87. So essentially the story begins with Superman, yes, the main Superman, mourning the death of his cousin Kara. He famously died in Crisis on Infinite Earths issue 7, battling the Anti-Monitor. While Kal was grieving, an alien spaceship fired a beam that transported him to Earth Prime. And finally around the Earth and exploring it, Kal eventually reaches New England, where he comes across a boy in a Superboy costume floating in the air. As the two compare notes, the young boy, who's also called Clark Kent, but for reasons completely unrelated to Superman, his adoptive parents named that because his mother Naomi always wanted a child named Clark and she just happened to marry someone for the last name of Kent. Clark had a pretty uneventful life. He's always financially stable due to his father owning a computer business and his mother owning a law firm. At least that's how I assume law firms work. Please correct me in the comments. Like most upper middle class children, Clark had a decently sized friend group and was teased for his name. Was even called Superboy, but didn't really let that get to his head. Eventually, Clark befriended a girl who had the name of Lori Lemon. She's important because she has LL initials. Anyways, as the boy realizes he's Kryptonian, a giant tidal wave begins to build up in Hampton Beach, which is where Clark was having a small crushing party with his friends. Together, the two evaporate the tidal wave and save Clark's friends being crushed to death and forced into a watery grave. They then spend more time together. This is pretty big for both Clark, Superboy Prime, and Kal, Earth 1 Superman, because well, Clark gets to hang out with his hero who's read so much about, I think. Kal is essentially experiencing something similar to what he had with Kara, but this time it's a literal younger version of himself, and gives him a taste of what having a proper psychic could be like. Like, long story short, the two essentially defeat the aliens which transported Kal to Earth Prime. Clark introduces himself to Superboy, to his family, and then goes with Kal to Earth 1, which this particularly funny panel takes place in. Want to see what it's like to be a reporter? Like the other Clark Kent? I thought about doing that when I grew up, but I decided I'd rather be test pilot like Hal Jordan. Hal Jordan, give me strength. Then immediately after that, the cosmic vortex caught Clark and he wouldn't be seen again until the closing issues of Crisis at Infinite Earths. By the time Clark joined the event properly, Earth Prime was completely destroyed by antimatter wars, meaning he never could get home ever again, which means he also died at this point. Side note, but do you remember we all just died towards the end of antimatter? It didn't come back to 2006? Shit was crazy. Anyways, at this point, Clark was stuck on an Earth which didn't really have much use for him, and together with a bunch of heroes, were able to fully defeat the Anti-Monitor. Clark was willing to accept his fate and die a hero, knowing that while his world was destroyed, the world his heroes reside on would live on. But Alexander Luthor Jr. from Earth 3, long story, found a paradise dimension to take him. The original Superman from Earth 2, yes, the guy in Action Comics issue 1 cover, and the original Lois Lane as well for good measure. After the crisis was over, the Four watched the new Earth through the paradise dimension. But over time, they saw things were getting better. Like things were getting more grim, more dark, more unnecessarily violent and harsh. And to that, Clark saw all this unfold, and he thought to himself, perhaps things are better in my world. But before I properly examine this part of Clark's story, we need to turn our attention to the comic book landscape and how fans felt about a lot of it and how it's reflected in Infinite Crisis. Because during the 80s, a lot of strict comic book guidelines and Comics Code Authority essentially lessened due to a multitude of factors happening throughout the decades. As a result, the 80s was probably the first major era where the comics essentially grew up, which led to some really mature and dark storylines. Sure, it wasn't really the first era to do so. The Bronze Age comics in the 70s in particular laid the groundwork for more mature and serious storytelling. But the 80s was more the general genre will definitely took more of a notice towards it. Two comics in particular that are often brought up within this conversation are The Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen, and both are really gripping stories which brought up all sorts of questions and themes about not just the superhero genre, but about society and the changing times as well. However, most comic book editors and fans at the time only thought the comics were good because they were violent and dark, resulting in more shallow stories being improved and published, which also sold really well. This pushed edgy stories only got worse in the following decades, and while not every story the big two published was an ultra-violent gore fest, definitely paved the way for what a lot of people consider the dark age of comics. The 90s. At that point, some fans didn't really like the edgy new direction that comics were taking and often clamored for the days of old silly stories and stories that were just overly depressing, dark and violent. Some of this was justified, sure, but other times it was essentially a form of toxic nostalgia, essentially a dismissal for the good that actually came from the dark age. Sure, people often ragged in the 90s for ridiculous outfits, big oversized weapons, weird artwork, and mindless action. For every Youngblood, there was a Starman. For every Avengers The Crossing, there was a Grant Morrison JLA, you get the idea. And even on the opposite end, for every good story, there was shit that flat out just didn't make any sense. Like Black Canary's convoluted pre-crisis history, and every Ant-Man design, like, seriously, what the hell is my man even wearing? Toxic nostalgia essentially dictates that new bad and old good. It's not just common in the comic fandom, but pretty much everywhere as well. And that kind of toxic nostalgia is a prominent theme of Infinite Crisis. So essentially in the story, the DC universe essentially got into shit. After the Identity Crisis retcons, which are whole can of worms of themselves, but important to my points here. Both the superhero and supervillains of Earth essentially prompted into doing more morally ambiguous or evil things. In short, things have gone more unnecessarily dark. In particular, Khan, the clone Superboy from the 90s, essentially discovered that he was also cloned using Lex Luthor's DNA, and as a result is having an emotional crisis, which in that particular infuriates Clark. Khan essentially has a life that he was promised and is essentially ripped away from Clark. A career Superboy, friends who cared for him, a girlfriend, and a proper place in the DC universe. In this regard, I always feel like Khan represents the good aspects of the 90s era of comics that so many fans like Clark essentially pushed away or disregarded completely. With that all happening, Alex Luthor essentially decided to take advantage of Clark's emotional state and set forth a plan that will essentially restore the multiverse. But it wasn't really for a noble reason. Oh no. Alex wanted to essentially create the perfect multiverse. If anything he considered bad, erased from existence. The plan involved Clark punching the walls of the Paradise Dimension, which somewhat altered reality and saved Jason Todd, the Doomtron, and some time environments of the Legion superhero timelines, don't ask. Moving planets around, which started a few intergalactic wars, giving the Black Diamond of Eclipso to Gene Loring, and essentially taking advantage of the state of the DC universe to benefit their plans. Some people often speculate that Jason's revival was either intentional or unintentional by Prime, I'm calling this now, and I used to be in the unintentional camp, but the more I thought about it, I suddenly realized that when Prime was doing his retcon punches, it was actually his way of trying to fix things, so yeah, I consider that intentional now. I even managed to get Cal 2 on board by taking advantage of the fact that Lois 2 was dying of natural causes, and saying it was because of a sickness from New Earth that was affecting the Paradise Dimension as well. And now a vital part of the plan was essentially to trap a bunch of characters who represented the pre-crisis universes to a machine that would essentially restore the multiverse. And they needed Power Girl as the Earth 2 representative. To make a long story short, she essentially comes from Earth 2, but after the original Crisis, reality kept trying to alter it to fit into New Earth. Just kind of a meta commentary how the character was handled post-Crisis and keeping with themes of Infinite Crisis. But anyways, as the duo's plan moved into the next stage, Prime decided to give Con a visit and just tell him, oh, you're not proper Superboy, you're a filthy clone, which to Con responded with, go fuck yourself, mate. Which Prime started a mass fight which led to probably Prime's infamous moments. This is a problem that Infinite Crisis kind of has in general. It criticizes the violent and dark side of DC Comics, but at the same time it kind of revels and delights in those moments. Maybe that is intentional. After all, Prime, who spent a lot of the story getting angry and whining about the violence of New Earth, essentially fucking decapitates Panther, blows a hole through Baby Wildebeest, rips up Risk's arm, and executes Bushido. Maybe this was the point, to essentially depict the criticizes as violent crybaby soy jacks, but the main problem is that there's no real proper response to those criticisms at all. You could argue that later in the story, when Earth 2 was quote-unquote restored, and they all started natural causes anyways, and Superman and Earth 2 got angry and attacked Cal of New Earth, his response was to come back to those criticisms. Was a perfect Earth doesn't need a Superman. I read it as DC saying, yeah, things have gone more worse, more dark, more violent. If things are perfect, Superman wouldn't have to exist, which is an insane Solomon fallacy, but I kinda digress. Anyways, after Prime's fight the Titans, Doom Patrol, and the JSA, who shot in the Speed Force by almost every speedster in the DC universe, they hoped it would contain him, but surprise! It didn't do jack shit! He bought an armor which resembled the anti-Lord his armor, which symbolizes that he became the exact thing he fought against in the original Crisis, a careless monster willing to destroy universes to get the things he wanted. To make another long story short, he tried to defend the device the multiversal characters were hooked up to, but was intercepted by Khan, and the two ended up flying for the tower, which killed Khan in the process. It gets better later, trust me. Prime obviously took great pleasure knowing that the quote-unquote imposter died. Little does he know it was mostly for legal reasons I'll get into in a bit. I went to Metropolis to kill a bunch of characters who were fighting each other in Metropolis. Yeah. In particular, he killed Kill 'Em Off, which could be considered a mercy kill depending on if you like or hate Jaraxes, or how you pronounce his name. The heroes of Earth then rallied together to defeat Prime, but he decided to fly to Oa to essentially commit genocide and cause another Big Bang to reform the universe. Only he knew. But anyways, he was intercepted by the two Green Lantern Corps. 32 of them were killed in the process, so the two Supermen took Prime, threw him into Krypton's red sun, and flew to Mogo, in the process of powering all three of them. Unfortunately, Prime beat the original Superman from Earth 2, the guy on the cover of Action Comics issue 1, to death with his bare hands, but the Superman of New Earth was able to beat him in the end. I feel like this moment was probably there where a lot of people began to hate Prime, not just for his strongman attitude, but because he killed the original Superman from like the 1930s. Like, that's fucking crazy, man. Anyways, the story ends with the Green Lantern Corps imprisoning Prime in a cell near Red Sun, surrounded by 50 Green Lanterns, most of them there as a punishment. Prime would then carve an S onto his chest because Cal ripped him off his shirt, and declared he'd get out eventually because he's been in worse places before. Something out from the back of my head when reading Prime's experience in Infinite Crisis is that he doesn't really see the people he's killing as quote-unquote actual people. Rather, since he grew up in essentially the real world, he treats them as simple characters, Christian dependent, so killing them wouldn't really mean he was killing actual people, when he himself is also a character, which I think perfectly adds his hypocrisy. Anyways, Prime will be brought back a year later for an event in John's Green Lantern run, known as... Honestly, this era is where I really think DC leaned too much into the whiny, violent fanboy aspect of the character, particularly with this story. Also, in the real world at this time, leak rights to Superboy were being essentially taken to court because DC Comics never really treated Schuster Siegel well, even though they created the most famous fucking superhero of all time. So in short, they just had to kill Khan off and rename Prime to Superman Prime. I'm gonna keep calling him Prime for now. Something to know is that the Anti-Model was also revived after Infinite Crisis and essentially like a big part of the Sinestro Corps. And Prime never really forgave him for, destroying his whole fucking home. But the two have to work together on Sinestro, orchestrating a massive universe-wide attack with his own piss-colored core. Prime didn't really play a massive part in the event. I mean, it is a Sinestro event after all. What ended up happening was he was discredited parts. He survived a massive jump with most of the heroes of New Earth, and fought a Wonder Woman with so damn yacht, essentially a really powerful Green Lantern who also has Superman's powers. Essentially that shitty OC you created when you were a kid, but actually cool. With a lead weakness, because he's a Daxamite, which Prime takes full advantage of as the fight was taken to a nuclear plant lined with lead, so it did not end well for yacht. Anyways, during the final battle on Earth, the Guardians of the Universe was just dropping nukes on the Anti-Monitor, and Prime essentially decided to finish him off by throwing him into space. He then goes full enlightened centrist and starts attacking members of his own corps as well as the Green Lanterns, which ends in when a Guardian essentially steals a move from Chaozu's book and blows himself up, seemingly taking Prime with him. What ended up happening was that he was somehow transported to another universe, and the atoms of the Guardian somehow infused with Prime, which aged him up. I literally do not know how that could work in any actual logical sense, but okay, I guess. Anyways, we get to... Countdown to Final Crisis. The series is pretty infamous for a variety of reasons, but I believe this at this point people really got sick of Prime. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's the Cars reviewing it was where his signature voice for Prime came from, which is pretty important to how the general public perceived the character. Yes, I had to read all of Countdown to fully do this video. Even when I started, I didn't think it was that bad, even though I knew what I was getting myself into, but boy, did the plot drag on and on. Fuck. And Prime, the character doing this whole thing on, didn't even show up to like halfway through the series, and the first impression is attacking a good guy like Luthor by fucking getting his body and making it go for the atmosphere or some shit, I don't know. So the context is that on Earth 15 is essentially a quote-unquote perfect world where everyone's happy and nice, but Prime essentially kills Lazard of that world, who's a good guy and also Superman. Vaporizes his pregnant wife, yeah, what the fuck, and essentially burns Lex to death for flying through the atmosphere in Justice League Watchtower. Also, while fighting everyone, his dialogue was comically wildy and childish. Like, you can rationalize him as being in like his lowest point was, but he grew up, but he mentally aggressed into an angry toddler. But practically, it seems more on the character just by how comically bad the dialogue is. Like, Flanderized him. It's essentially where the whole infamous "I'll kill you to death" line comes from. In fact, I'm not a fan of this incarnation of Prime. It feels like I took the story jack to a whole new level here. Anyways, he fully destroys Earth 15 like an auraless Omni-Man, tortures Mr. Mixer Splitlick, and Earth Zatanna, and essentially makes his way to the Monitor's base, who are essentially the Watchers of Marvel, but somehow even more useless, and eventually makes his way to Monarch, who's essentially leading a superpowered army for a reason I actually forgot. The fight ends with kind of Monarch essentially nuking the universe, but since Prime was kind of broken, I'm counting it as a second genocide. God, I think Kara is right about this comic. There's so much fucking death in this book. Jesus Christ. I'm gonna be completely honest, his Prince and Countdown don't really add a lot to his character arc aside from his genocides. You could easily jump from his initial Cold War and straight into Illusion of Free Wars, and nothing would really change, minus the two, genocides he caused. Heck, his Prince and Countdown even ends the same way they did in his National Cold War. Big explosion transports him to another universe or timeline. But they are important because I think I'll contribute to his reputation to DC fans at the time. I think for many, this is the straw that comes back and solidified Prime as more of a crybaby than as of DC fans, and to be honest, I can't really blame them. Anyways, that all leads us into the next part of Prime's story. So Prime was just floating there in the time machine when all of a sudden the Time Trapper, Major Legion of Superheroes baddie by the way, transported him to the 31st century. He's Superboy again because the Owen energy vanished, which sure I guess. And then murks a racist couple and goes into the Superman Museum, which implies that every other hero gets a special museum, like the Flash. I wonder what the Firestorm Museum in the 31st century is like. But after seeing that it was barely a part of the Hall of Villains, and that history said they got wrecked by Con and Sodam, he threw one of his famous tantrums and decided to gather all the villains of the Legion of Superheroes and decided to attack them all. But he did learn something in particular. Cosmic King, Lightning Lord, and Saturn Queen all followed a code of evil inspired by a evil mysterious being whose name was never spoken. It inspired Prime to attempt to make his mark on history and Superman in general. The new Legion of Supervillains are so effective and so powerful they completely overwhelmed the Legion of Superheroes, as shocking as it may seem considering they have so many members, but I digress. It got so bad that Brainiac 5, the husband to George Constantine from Tomodachi Life Island, had to bring in the other two incarnations of the Legion of Superheroes from throughout the multiverse so they have a better chance of winning. That paired with the return of that timeline Sodam Yat who got inspired after the death of the Green Lantern Legion timeline, rest in peace Ron Vidar, you're my goat, and the resurrection of both Bart Allen and Connor Kent would prove to be a significant effort that would turn the tide in the Legion's favor. Anyways, that incarnation of the Time Trapper was revealed to be a future version of Prime. One thing to know about the Time Trapper is his identities and focus because of how DC timelines operate, or be changed later in this video, just try not to question it. I always saw the Time Trapper version of Prime as sort of a darker future for the character, where he could go if he keeps up what he's doing. One way he kept holding him to his spiteful attitudes against things he didn't like. What ends up happening to Time Trapper Prime is that after getting his ass kicked by Legionnaires throughout history, he then gets dragged in the 31st century where Prime is also out there, and he gets rage baited into punching his older version, which does some more timey-wimey stuff and transports Prime back to his home universe. When he finally went home, he was met with fear. Laurie and his Prime tried everything he did, and everything Prime was capable of, and they're rightfully scared. I mean, I would be too fat to read Countdown again. I can't imagine what must have gone through the head seeing the baby boy commit 2 genocides. The coverage ends with Prime starting multiple arguments online through DC forums, which is pretty funny, not gonna lie. Not much comics end like that. I once heard somewhere that Geoff Johns himself roleplayed his Prime in the forums in real life, but I checked and there's no real evidence of that being a thing, so take the claim with a grain of salt. One of the interesting ideas that's brought up to Prime, however, is that definitely gets expanded on later, is that redemption is not an impossibility. Sure, it doesn't really get to factor in this story, but the next time Prime appears, it really gets expanded on the 2 Blackest Night tie-ins to Adventure Comics. Here we see Prime in a unique position. He's sort of living in a basement and just reading comics and going online. Parents are scared shitless of him, and it's inferred he did something bad to Laurie. He's never outright stated, but the book implies that Prime killed her, but I don't think that's really the case. Not only with how the story ends, but because it doesn't really fit in with Prime's views on killing. Sure, he can commit genocides in other fictional universes because they're not real, kind of like video game NPCs in GTA, but to him, Earth Prime is the real world, and Laurie to him is a real human being. The story ends with her in an arm sling, which I think infers that he simply broke her arm, but she also supplied a Black Lantern on her hand, so who really knows? Anyways, at the start of the story, Prime is reading Adventure Comics issue 4, which also happens to be the story I'm reading right now. Ends with the ending. He panics because he's in the story, and ends up fighting Black Lantern versions of the characters he's killed, led by his old Infinite Crisis collaborator Alex Luthor Jr. of Earth 3. The story is all about Prime's insecurities. He always cared about how people perceived him, and set during the point where fans hated him, and the book takes full advantage of this. Also, side note, but at the start of the story, he's essentially wearing a black shirt with Superman logo and jeans, just like Con. I don't know what else to say, I just want to point out he's wearing the attire the character hates. I think that's like thematically fitting, but I don't really know how, but yeah, I just think it does go off it. One of that story was to also explore Prime's emotions, to show that the bright-eyed kid from DC Comics Presents issue 87 was still there despite all that rage, not just for the world around him, but also for himself. When Prime puts in the Black Ring, all his emotions are brought to the surface: his will to keep fighting for respect, his regrets for what he did to Laurie, his wants for everyone to love him, his fears for the hero he once loved, and the self-loathing he hates what he's become, a laughingstock, an embodiment of a toxic mindset. He wants it to matter, he wants it to fit into what didn't belong him, but he threw it all the way over for toxic nostalgia, and he did be despise himself for that. His emotions Egyptians overpowered the black ring he put on, and as a result, they fired the surrounding Black Lanterns he was fighting. The story ends with Laurie coming down to tell Prime that leave him alone, which doesn't even take that long, let's be real here. As I said before, the story implies that she's the Black Lantern. Her speech balloons are a darker shade of white, and she's even had a ring on her, but personally, I think that's not really the case, and you can argue against me because DC canon's like that. I think this is DC's way of saying, yeah, you may not like this character, but we think it's pretty interesting, and you may say listen, but we'll bring him back fully eventually. Prime will next be seen again in like a year later in the final 2 issues of Teen Titans Volume 3, Issue 98. He gets brought back from Earth Prime to New Earth by some villain who can create portals or some shit, and he's pretty pissed about being separated from Laurie, which I think confirms my theory. He then forms a team of young villains who the express purpose of countering the Titans. He even found 3 evil clones of Kong, which represents him in various stages of his life. Not really much to note about what Prime does here in these appearances, because he's usually generally just a giant fight scene, but as him being trapped inside the Source Wall, which is essentially a giant barrier related to the New God, which is notable for trapping people who dare bypass it, which is where Prime remained for the rest of the DC universe until Flashpoint happened, and so did the New 52. You might be surprised that the character wasn't really being used for a while. I'm personally surprised because the New 52 was not liked by fans, and it would be a decent opportunity to use him again, but instead he was in limbo for over 8 years until he appeared again of all things Shazam 2019. Somehow Prime escaped the Source Wall, but as a result got trapped in one because of the magic lens for some reason. How did he end up here, you may ask? And the answer is, I don't know, honestly. Sorry. When Dr. Savannah and Mr. Mind, a talking caterpillar, ventured into there to assemble the Monster Side of Evil, a classic Captain Marvel villain team, and then more loose upon Earth, all except for Superboy Prime. But that didn't matter anyways, because Mr. Mind opened a rift or something, which allowed the Denzi into the magic lens to wreak havoc on Earth, which includes Prime. I'm gonna be honest, his inclusion story does feel really random. He doesn't really contribute anything meaningful to the plot until the second last issue, and seems to be there for the he's back clout. But I guess it opened the door for the character to be used again, and so it was brought back for a big DC event called Death Metal, which I think was more meaningful for him in there because it's like the start of his redemption arc. To make a very long story short, there's a massive multiversal crisis going on, which must be like a yearly occurrence in the DC universe. And due to a bunch of other shit going on, one thing in particular is that the villains of the event, Perpetua and the Batman who laughs, yes, him, essentially created 3 worlds where all the crises were happening simultaneously. Crisis, Infinite, and Final. Superboy Prime was recruited by the villain to essentially oversee this new world. Also, he revealed that when the Source Wall broke in the previous event, it allowed him to escape, but it was approached by Batman who laughs. So I guess for the timelines that he escaped, he got to push on captivity to the magic land, and things played out as usual. I don't know if that's like an accurate timeline, but hey, it works. Anyways, Wonder Woman traveled to Infinite Crisis universe and got captured by Prime. While she was in captivity, he made her watch as he made his own perfect worlds unfolding. Essentially a facsimile of pre-crisis, but more fluffy for lack of a better term. But as Prime was doing his whole usual spiel, ranting for how things were better on his world, and how he'd make a deal with the devil to ensure his perfect world is like a reality. Wonder Woman admitted something crazy, that he was right. How the world wasn't the same as it used to be. The only constant is change, and that change isn't always a good thing, but instead of fighting against it, the proper answer is to accept and embrace change, and remain hopeful in how you can have a perfect world, not at the expense of another one. I responsible for the possibility that it would just be destroyed eventually, and that it just shot in the dark. Diana responded to the fact that that's what Superman is in general. A shot in the dark. Anyways, I was able to get Prime on their side, and these are my favorite moments of the character. At this point in the event, every character has memories back from every incarnation of DC, which could be a good or bad thing depending on how you look at it, so everyone has his guts as a result. And he doesn't really care about what's happening at the moment, because he thinks it won't matter. Like, if they win, it will be rebooted or wiped away, whatever, just like the original Crisis. But as Prime is mocking, Crypto the Superdog comes to him. This causes Prime to remember the first story he read about him, and then he finds Batman who laughs is gone now or something. While putting him down, he's about to regress to who he was before, like Infinite Crisis, more than destroy what came before. But before he could do that, Crypto showed it up. This caused Prime to cry, not because of being pathetic, because how he realizes that he wasn't right at all. Everything matters. Every story from DC does matter. No matter what gets wiped from canon, as long as it left a positive effect on someone, it wasn't really worth this. Was it? Batman who laughs and gives Prime a final offer. Join his army of evil Superman and give him a perfect world. One where everyone loves him. One where he fits in. One where he's finally a hero. But Prime makes that last one a reality by refusing his offer and punching him so hard the evil words around the hero start to vanish. But in the process, no one knows that Prime did it. No one except Crypto. Oops, he's close to death, but as he turned the page, Prime is putting back in Earth Prime and reading that same issue. As he's finished, Laurie went into his room and invited him to something. Like a walk. As the story ends, Prime went out for a walk with Laurie and a new white dog, and when all of a sudden, a speeding car is about to hit a child. Prime then tries to save the kid, but to his surprise, he did. And in the final panel, which homages the first Superman cover, which is pretty cute, he even tells the reader to touch him grass, which is a great exposition from arguing people on the internet. So overall, a pretty good ending from Prime, where he got his happy ending. Right? So what ended up really happening is that the time trapper, who's Doomsday now, don't question it, saved Prime at the last minute or something and transported him into a pocket universe, which is actually important for preserving Superboy and Supergirl's post-crisis, but I can't explain it right now because it'll take too long. In short, the time trapper remodeled the pocket universe into a duplicate of Earth Prime and kept Superboy Prime there until he would be needed for something. At this point, Prime is pretty much 100% where he's a comic book character and can talk directly to the audience, which may seem grating for some, but unlike Deadpool, rather than spying pop culture references, Prime is also referencing comic book tropes, archetypes, and terminologies, which I find way more fun in my opinion. Also, some point Prime did his reality punch and teamed up with Black Suit Spider-Man for an adventure. One day Happy does another one, as an interaction with certain Reed Richards character has a lot in common with, surprisingly. Anyways, Time Trapper needs Prime and regular Superman for a task, so they travel to the future to save Booster Gold, but at this point regular Superman doesn't remember because of DC's timeline and they got erased somehow. Regular Superman also takes note of Prime's carefree attitude, to which he responds with the fact that he already knows how this event's gonna end, due being really familiar with comics at this point. When they get to the 31st century, they saw something really horrifying. A feature of so many dead Legionnaires. Even Prime was horrified. Sure, he still saw them as characters and as a shock moment mainly, but resolved to find Booster and fix everything with a team he was previously trying to murder about 20 years ago. Hate his guts. When they were scoping out where he was being held, Prime points out in the funniest way that Cosmic Boy was using his hands to spray Legionnaires even though he has magnetism, which is a plot hole to him. The imposter turned out to be the dark side version of Chameleon Boy. After regular Superman saved Booster, Prime pretended to face heel turn, but then betrayed the Absolute Legion in a critical moment. Sent regular Superman home, who gave him his old flight ring because he now trusted him. It's just got the surviving Legionnaires to fight alongside him. Anyways, the Legion Superboy Prime were able to hold off the Absolute versions long enough, but they're overwhelmed, and Prime had to escape back to the 21st century. He crashed into the Fortress of Solitude, while Lois was talking to holograms of Jorah and Lara, who had information something important for the event, like the Absolute or whatever, I don't fucking know. Prime told Lois that he needed to talk to regular Superman, but she told him that he would enter the Find Tournament, which is the big setup for last year's DC KO event. Anyways, Fred the Absolute Legionnaires found Prime and Lois, with their Surgeon Boy essentially reviving Lois's powers that she had in Rebirth. After that happened, she was able to briefly knock him out. Prime then activated a bunch of Superman robots to assist with helping her out, with one in particular joining him and Lois. They all have like information, like they can help Doomsday or whatever, so yeah. When they were passing the Arctic, the Superman robot essentially flew away because it heard cries of help. It was programmed to save lives, even in the most dire of situations, which is a really Superman thing to do, which I really like. When they got to the city, it turned out that the people in trouble with the Royal Flush Gang were minor Justice League villains. They were looting the building because they knew something was happening, but they didn't know it was a major event. Prime wanted to fight them, but the Superman robot was essentially convincing to saving them, and the gang sort of turned themselves into a safe containment unit in space or something. The gang then went to the Justice League Watchtower, which had been completely distracted by the Absolute Legion, and the Time Traveler being really close to death. The robot was about to give the Time Traveler information from the three main Absolute Legionnaires that arrived, and they were fully about to destroy the robot when Prime arrived and started fighting them. Throughout the fight, Prime was overpowering Lightning Lad, and was literally ready to kill him. The Assassin Girl, who had a mental link with Darkseid severed. Yeah, the Absolute Legion were manipulated because the universe exists in a setting which runs in despair, and by that point the 31st century was in constant war. Expect him to not kill Garth, so he didn't. The Absolute Legion then left the area, and the robot delivered the information to Doomsday. He wasn't credited for just destruction and killing Superman, but reviving a second chance as well, which is mirrored to Prime, as well as how Doomsday essentially gave him a second chance, not just life, for being a hero as well. I think that's oddly beautiful. Anyways, in the main event, Doomsday / Time Traveler essentially sacrificed himself to give Prop Superman some like energy or something, and allows him to win the event and essentially disappear for like a year or something. With Doomsday dead and Superman doing like something, Prime took it upon himself to essentially become the new Superman while the regular one was gone. So far he's still the main Superman. He's trying to just be heroic, struggling with all the demons, and even works at a comics book shop, howling around with the Kent and going on a rant about how much he hates one more day to the customers. Shame. But the problem with the story so far is that Mark Kent lectured Power Girl and told her to lay off Prime, which is kind of insane, just because despite the redemption I've covered, I still think it's fair that Karen, not calling her Paige, should still despise Prime for what he did the original Superman. I think that's why I'm going to wrap up this video. While Saga has a way to kill two birds with one stone during a crossover story, essentially a four-way character, turned into a criticism of the DC fandom, which eventually turns into a story of redemption. I think it's perfectly like captures the comic book landscape that's always changing, always evolving. And I think that Prime is the best representation of that in my eyes. For characters who was so despite being a mockery is now celebrated for being a fun reflection of the good parts of fandom culture, even if it does have some violent tendencies. And I think that's just beautiful. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed the video today. Sorry it took a while. I wanted to put more effort into this project. Big thanks to Twitter user at Adam487 for providing a Twitter thread for Superboy Prime's appearances. It would have been a much harder time if it wasn't for you, so I salute you for your service. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn notifications on, and in conclusion, read the Fury of Firestorm issue 226. It's currently slated for 9 issues, but it'd be cool if the series reached like at least 25 issues. And Kid Gamiverse is kind of a baddie, don't at me.